For almost 2,000 years, the people of Pompeii were silent. Then archaeologists found their shapes. Bodies had disappeared beneath the volcanic deposits left by Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, but something extraordinary remained behind: cavities preserving the outlines of people caught in the disaster. Centuries later, archaeologists filled some of those cavities with plaster, creating the famous casts that seem to show the final moments of ordinary Romans. And from those shapes, stories emerged. A mother embracing her child. Two sisters dying together. A family trying to escape. But there was a problem. The casts could preserve a person's position. They could preserve the shape of clothing. Sometimes they could even preserve bones. What they could not reliably tell archaeologists was who those people actually were. Now, ancient DNA has entered the investigation. And in several cases, the genetic evidence doesn't simply add details to the old stories. It changes them. One person long described as a mother was genetically male. The child beside him was not his biological child. And two people whose final position had been interpreted as an embrace were not the sisters they were sometimes believed to be. But the most important discovery may not be about any one victim. Because when researchers looked at the ancestry of these Pompeians, the DNA began pointing toward a much larger story about the Roman world. A city that looked Roman in every possible way was carrying a genetic history that reached far beyond Italy. And that is where the story of Pompeii becomes much bigger than the eruption itself. Pompeii was not a mythical city frozen perfectly in time. It was a living Roman settlement in Campania, about 14 miles southeast of modern Naples. People worked there. Families lived there. Merchants moved through it. And its population existed inside one of the most interconnected political systems of the ancient Mediterranean. Then, in 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius erupted. The eruption buried Pompeii beneath pumice and ash. The disaster destroyed lives, but it also created an archaeological time capsule. As the bodies decomposed, they left cavities in the hardened volcanic material. During excavations in the 19th century, archaeologists began filling some of those cavities with plaster. The result was haunting. The plaster reproduced the external shape of the victims. And because some skeletal material remained embedded inside the casts, archaeologists could study aspects of the people themselves. But the casts created a strange problem. They looked extraordinarily personal. A hand position. A bracelet. A child's body. Two figures lying close together. The human brain naturally turns those details into a story. And once a story becomes familiar, it can be difficult to separate what was actually observed from what was inferred. That distinction became critical when scientists began asking a simple question. What if the casts had been telling us how these people died, but not who they were? In 2024, researchers published a study examining ancient DNA and strontium isotope evidence from 5 Pompeii individuals represented in plaster casts. The team extracted genetic material from skeletal remains embedded within the casts. This was not a modern DNA test in the ordinary sense. There were no family tree websites, no database matching, no ancient equivalent of a birth certificate. Instead, researchers recovered fragmented genetic material and analyzed genome-wide markers, mitochondrial DNA, genetic sex, ancestry, and, where possible, biological relationships. The goal was not simply to put names on anonymous victims. It was to test the stories archaeologists and the public had built around them. And one of those stories had become especially famous. It involved the House of the Golden Bracelet. In 1974, 4 victims were discovered close together. 2 adults and a young child appeared to form a family. One adult had been associated with the child and wore an elaborate golden bracelet. The scene seemed almost to tell its own story. A mother. Her child. Another adult who might have been the father. The interpretation was understandable. But understandable is not the same thing as proven. The genetic evidence produced a very different picture. The adult wearing the golden bracelet was genetically male. And genetic analysis found no evidence that the adult and child were biologically related. In fact, the researchers found no biological relationship, up to the 3rd degree, among the 4 individuals in that group. The physical scene had suggested a family. The genome did not. That does not mean archaeologists had been careless. It means the evidence available to them had limits. Imagine finding a person holding a child. Without DNA, the most intuitive explanation might be that the adult was the child's parent. But a volcanic disaster does not preserve intentions. The adult might have been protecting the child. The two might have been fleeing together. They might have encountered one another during the chaos. The position of the bodies cannot automatically distinguish among those possibilities. DNA can answer a different question. Are these people biologically related? In this case, the answer was no. And suddenly, a scene that had been interpreted as a family became something much more uncertain. That matters because Pompeii has always been unusually vulnerable to storytelling. The casts are visually powerful. They make anonymous victims appear recognizable. A shape becomes a person. A person becomes a family. A family becomes a narrative. And eventually, the narrative can feel like historical fact. But genetics forced researchers to separate those layers. The same thing happened with another pair of victims. Two individuals were found close together in a position interpreted as an embrace. Previous interpretations suggested they could have been sisters, a mother and daughter, or even lovers. The nuclear genetic analysis successfully recovered from one of them showed that the individual was genetically male. That result excluded the interpretation that the pair were two sisters or a mother and daughter. Again, the DNA did not tell researchers exactly what happened between the two people. It did something more precise. It removed explanations that the genetic evidence could not support. And that distinction is crucial. Ancient DNA is powerful, but it is not a time machine. It cannot tell us what someone was thinking. It cannot automatically identify a person's name. It cannot reconstruct an entire life from a sequence of genetic markers. What it can do is provide biological evidence that can be compared with archaeology, skeletal analysis, artifacts, and geography. And sometimes that is enough to overturn a story that had seemed obvious. But the investigation was about to become much larger. Because the researchers weren't only asking, who were these people related to? They were also asking, where did their ancestors come from? To understand why that question matters, you have to leave the plaster casts for a moment. Imagine the Roman Empire at its height. Its roads crossed Europe. Ships moved across the Mediterranean. Soldiers traveled between provinces. Merchants carried goods between distant ports. People migrated for work, trade, military service, and family. Pompeii was part of that network. And the genetic evidence suggests that its population reflected it. The 5 individuals analyzed in the 2024 study showed ancestry patterns that were largely associated with populations connected to the Eastern Mediterranean, rather than simply matching the genetic profile expected from ancient populations of Italy. The researchers compared these genomes with ancient and modern reference populations. The result was not evidence that Pompeii had been populated by one single foreign group. Quite the opposite. The picture was one of diversity. The Pompeians with genome-wide data showed ancestry consistent with the wider movement of people through the Roman Mediterranean. And that creates a second contradiction. Pompeii looks intensely Roman. Its temples, its streets, its inscriptions, its houses, its political culture, its art. Everything seems to tell you where the city belongs. Italy, Rome, the Roman world. But genes do not always follow political borders. A person can live in one place while carrying ancestry inherited from populations that lived somewhere else generations earlier. That is one of the most important things ancient DNA can reveal. Archaeology shows us the culture people participated in. Genetics can reveal pieces of the population history behind them. Those two stories are not opposites. They are different layers of the same history. And Pompeii appears to have been a place where those layers overlapped. But there was another clue. One of the individuals from the study carried genetic ancestry consistent with an origin connected to Anatolian populations, while his mitochondrial lineage had a deeper history associated with the Near East or North Africa. Another individual showed mixed ancestry with possible Eastern Mediterranean and European sources. These findings do not allow researchers to say, this person was from country X. Ancient populations did not map neatly onto modern national identities. Instead, the DNA reveals connections, branches, movements, population mixtures. And those connections make the old picture of Pompeii more complicated. The city was Roman. Its people could also have ancestors from far beyond the Italian peninsula. Those facts can coexist. And they probably did. By this point, the investigation has already changed two assumptions. The body positions could not reliably establish family relationships, and appearance could not reliably establish ancestry. But there was still a deeper question. How unusual was this genetic diversity? If Pompeii was simply an isolated Italian town that happened to contain a few migrants, perhaps these results were exceptional. Or perhaps they were showing us something much larger about the Roman Empire. And this is where another ancient genome enters the story. In 2022, researchers reported the first complete ancient human genome from Pompeii, recovered from a man associated with the Casa del Fabbro, the House of the Craftsman. He was estimated to have been between 35 and 40 years old. His genome showed strong affinities with surrounding Central Italian populations from the Roman imperial period. That result might initially sound different from the later cast study, but it actually illustrates something important. Pompeii was not genetically uniform. Different individuals could have different ancestral histories. Some could show strong links to populations around Italy. Others could carry substantial ancestry connected to the Eastern Mediterranean. That is exactly what you would expect from a population living inside a highly connected empire. The genetic evidence is not telling us that Pompeii was secretly something other than Roman. It is showing us what being Roman could actually look like. And this changes the question. The question is no longer, were these people Italian or foreign? That framing is too simple for the ancient world. The better question is, how did people and ancestry move through the Mediterranean before the eruption? Because the Roman Empire did not merely move armies. It moved people, and their descendants left traces in their genomes. That is the larger revelation hidden inside the casts. If these DNA stories are worth following, subscribing helps keep them coming. Now return to Pompeii. The city is famous because the eruption preserved so much. But preservation is not the same as explanation. A preserved body tells us where someone was. A bracelet tells us something about material culture. A building tells us about architecture. A genome tells us about biological ancestry. None of these sources is complete by itself. The breakthrough comes when they are placed together. Consider the golden bracelet victim again. The archaeological scene suggested a mother with a child. The artifact encouraged that interpretation. The position of the bodies made it emotionally compelling. But the genetic evidence showed that the adult was male and unrelated to the child. The DNA did not tell us the complete story of their final moments. But it told us the old family story could not be accepted as fact. That is what makes this discovery more important than simply correcting the label, mother. It demonstrates how easily modern assumptions can enter archaeological interpretation. We naturally interpret bodies using familiar social categories. A person beside a child becomes a parent. Two people close together become siblings. An object associated with one person becomes evidence of identity. Sometimes those interpretations are correct. But sometimes the evidence is simply insufficient. Ancient DNA gives archaeologists another layer of evidence. And in Pompeii, that layer forced a rewrite. The same pattern appears in the broader ancestry results. The victims were not genetically identical representatives of a single local population. Their genomes reflected the movement and mixing characteristic of the Roman Mediterranean. That does not prove every Pompeian was descended from migrants. It does not mean the entire city came from the Eastern Mediterranean. And it certainly does not allow us to assign modern ethnic identities to ancient people. What it does show is that genetic diversity was already deeply embedded in Pompeii's population. And that fits the historical world around it. Rome had spent centuries connecting territories around the Mediterranean. People followed those connections. Sometimes they moved voluntarily. Sometimes through military service. Sometimes through trade. Sometimes through forced migration and slavery. The genetic record cannot always distinguish those pathways. But it can preserve the biological result. People moved. They met. They had children. Their ancestry crossed geographic boundaries. And eventually, Some of those descendants died in a city beneath Vesuvius. There is another important limitation. The 5 newly analyzed cast individuals are not the entire population of Pompeii. They are a sample. Ancient DNA preservation is difficult, and the researchers attempted genetic analysis on skeletal material from 14 casts undergoing restoration, but genome-wide data were successfully obtained for 5 individuals in the study. That means we should resist the temptation to turn 5 genomes into a complete genetic census of the city. Science does not work that way. The strength of the discovery comes from what these individuals demonstrate, not from pretending they represent every Pompeian. And yet, when their results are combined with earlier genomic evidence from Pompeii and with ancient DNA from the wider Roman world, a pattern becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Pompeii was connected. Its population carried evidence of those connections. And the famous casts were not simply frozen portraits of Roman types. They were fragments of individual lives inside a much larger Mediterranean network. That is why the identities of the victims were more complicated than we thought. Not because DNA revealed secret names. It didn't. Not because scientists suddenly discovered that the victims belonged to some hidden civilization. They didn't. The real revelation is more subtle. The stories we built from appearances were sometimes wrong. The family relationships we inferred were sometimes wrong. And the ancestry hidden inside these people was more geographically connected than the casts could ever show. For centuries, the plaster bodies appeared to tell us exactly who these people were. Now the genome is teaching us to be more careful. A body beside a child is not automatically a mother. 2 people dying together are not automatically sisters. A person living in Italy is not genetically isolated from the rest of the Mediterranean. And a city that looks culturally unified can contain thousands of different ancestral stories. The eruption of Vesuvius froze a moment. But DNA opened the history behind that moment. And when the evidence is placed together, Pompeii becomes something different from the familiar image. Not a city populated by anonymous figures frozen in one dramatic afternoon. A living crossroads. A place where ancestry traveled. Where populations mixed. Where people formed relationships that archaeology can only partly reconstruct. And where the final positions of the dead sometimes created stories that their own genomes could quietly contradict. The most remarkable thing is that the DNA did not make the victims less human. It made them less predictable. The plaster preserved the moment they died. Their genomes preserved pieces of the journeys that came before. And nearly 2,000 years later, those journeys are still changing the story of Pompeii.